Hello and welcome to our second edition of Inside Iraq Special, here from George Washington University in the heart of the American capital. My name is Jassim Azzawi. 4 years ago, when President Bush embarked on his war on Iraq, critics charge major American newspapers, TV networks, and news organizations abdicated their traditional role of rational inquiry and critical investigation. Instead, they had become involved in promoting and spinning the president's message and his war plan, some content. But when the war dust settled, horrific images of mutilated bodies, charred rubble, violence, and chaos raised crucial moral and political questions of international legitimacy, fairness, and limitations of U.S. power. 4 years after that fateful decision to go to war, we raise overarching and haunting questions vis-à-vis the American press and media. What went wrong? Who's to blame? And perhaps more important, hello and welcome to our second edition of Inside Iraq Special, here from George Washington University in the heart of the American capital. My name is Jassim Azzawi. 4 years ago, when President Bush embarked on his war on Iraq, critics charge major American newspapers, TV networks, and news organizations abdicated their traditional role of rational inquiry and critical investigation. Instead, they had become involved in promoting and spinning the president's message and his war plan, some content. But when the war dust settled, horrific images of mutilated bodies, charred rubble, violence, and chaos raised crucial moral and political questions of international legitimacy, fairness, and limitations of U.S. power. 4 years after that fateful decision to go to war, we raise overarching and haunting questions vis-à-vis the American press and media. What went wrong? Who's to blame? And perhaps more importantly, was the American media an unwitting accomplice or an active and eager partner of the Bush administration? Here is Josh Rushing.
In the months leading up to the invasion of Iraq, the Bush administration unleashed a media assault on America.
If we wait, he will continue to develop ever more deadly capabilities.
We don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
In order for America to defend itself, regime change was a must.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
The cell was a concerted effort at the highest levels of government.
This is evidence, not conjecture. This is true. This is all well documented. The gravity of this moment is matched by the gravity of the threat that Iraq's weapons of mass destruction pose to the world.
And even at the lower ranks, such as when I was a U.S. Marine spokesperson for Central Command.
So I think they're ready for us to get there. They're ready for us to liberate them. They're ready for some freedom.
But now, 4 years after the invasion, some questions have been answered. The U.S. government's own reports have disputed the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and links between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. But one question still remains. What was all that spin about?
Josh Rushing raising a very important question yet to be answered. Here today, we will raise some more questions of our own. And to help us answer some of them, and those others perhaps from the audience, we will be calling on the expertise of our panelists. Mr. Alberto Fernandez comes to us from the U.S. State Department. He's with the public diplomacy of the Near East. Michael Isikoff is a Newsweek investigative reporter and a co-author of a New York bestseller, Hubris, about the art of selling the war. Joshua Muravchik is a resident scholar and analyst with American Enterprise Institute, a man who advocated perhaps the war on Iraq, and he is calling on President Bush to keep his word and strike against Iran. Last but not least, here in Washington, D.C. is Scott Ritter, a former UN inspector in Iraq. And from San Francisco, we are joined by Professor Asad Abu Khalil, Professor of Political Science from California State University. Welcome, gentlemen, to this second edition of Inside Iraq. Scott Ritter, let me start with you. On the eve of the war, two emerging pictures were the dominant, one in the US and one outside the US. Within the US, that said this war is inevitable, it will be good for America, it will be good for Iraq, and more importantly, it will be quick and clean. And the picture outside Iraq, outside the US was, don't do it, this is going to be a bloody mistake. In your opinion, what lies behind those two contrasting images? Was it the message of the administration, or was it the role of the American media that played to portray that image?
Well, first of all, I think we need to be correct. Yes, in the United States, we seem to have a homogeneous position that was shared by the administration, the media, and the majority of the American public alike, which was Saddam Hussein is a threat worthy of military intervention. Military intervention was justified, and that this would probably go quickly and well for America and the forces of democracy. Outside the United States, you had, I think, a different opinion when it came to the public at large. But let's never forget that the United States was joined in this so-called crusade by Italy, by Poland, by Great Britain. We had political support in much of Europe. Japan voted in favor of military intervention. The Security Council voted unanimously for Resolution 1441. I think there was a disconnect between the political entities around the world and their population. And the reason for that disconnect was the probing inquisition of foreign media, who asked hard questions, demanded answers, and understood the concept of nuance. The American media failed egregiously to bridge the gap between ideological motivation, which is the realm of policymakers, and reality, given the truth to the American public. And that's why we see a disconnect today between the American public and this administration. The American public feels betrayed by the administration, but moreover, by a media that sold them a war on the basis of a false premise.
Since you mentioned the public about 4 or 5 times, Alberto Fernandez, and that disconnect, would you say that it played a critical role in the call for the war? Or was it all along that this war was inevitable, and regardless of the millions of people who protested within this country outside and outside the United States, war was inevitable?
I think one has to realize that there are always nuances and there are always gray areas in this field. I reject kind of the simple vision that you give of one view overseas and one view in the United States, because I think that within countries and within regions, one can also throw stones. For example, in the Arab world, you had Arab rulers and Arab regimes who, behind the scenes, enthusiastically, in one way or another, supported this war. And you have the high irony, for example, of this war, so-called war on Iraq, being planned and launched from the Emirate of Qatar, from Doha, where Al Jazeera is as well. So yes, throw stones at the Americans, but there's plenty of blame or plenty of criticism to throw around on this very complex subject.
As Abu Khalil, Alberto Fernandez brings a very, very important point. But having said what he said, would the coverage within the US, had it been different than what it was on the eve of the war, would the outcome would have been different? To what extent it was driven by the administration solely, or the media played a role in that also?
I do believe, without a doubt, that the media were complicit in this war because they provided the climate which made it possible for the administration not only to prepare for the war, but also to propagandize the lies and the deceptive elements of this war strategy, and later for the occupation. And this entire phenomenon of embedded journalism, I think, is going to go down as one of the shameful episodes of the history of American journalism. But I find it very ironic, if not funny, to find Alberto Fernandez citing the polygynous Arab princes and kings of the Middle East, those who preside over some of the worst tyrannies of the world, as convenient spokespeople for the Arab world. And I think he knows well that the Arab people know that they do not speak for them. Now, I understand that he wants the agreement that comes out with this relationship that they have with these tyrannies. But this is another element of the deception of this administration. How, on the one hand, you can claim to premise a war on democracy and the spread for liberty, of course, after we discovered that there are no WMDs in Iraq, and on the other hand, we realize that this war and the occupation not only have failed to establish an exemplary democracy in Iraq, but have even consolidated the abusive monarchies of the entire region. And now more than ever, they get away with human rights violation because they have done what they are told, and they do America's bidding in the Arab media, largely controlled by the Saudi government. So I do agree that we have to cast stones left and right, east and west. But we have to also say that it boils down to America's manipulation of public opinion in this country and also in the Arab world through the Saudi-owned media.
I will let Alberto Fernandez answer that perhaps later. But for the time being, Joshua Muravchik, to what extent the American newspapers and the media were lagging behind the American public sentiment that there was a grassroots abhorrence about this war, and yet perhaps that disconnect Scott Ritter mentioned existed right then?
No, I think the entire premise of this discussion is nonsense. I think that the lead-in by Josh Rushing was utter nonsense. A media assault on the American people because the president and the vice president were making speeches. That's a media assault. That is what we pay them to do. They are our employees. We pay them to make speeches. This is all.
No, not because they're making speeches, because they were lying to the American public.
I don't know who I'm listening to.
Let him finish.
Who am I listening to?
Go ahead, continue, Josh.
This is the norm of American politics. There's a very good argument to be made about whether the decision to go into Iraq was a wise decision or an unwise decision. It seemed wise to me at the time. It seems a lot more unwise now. But this has absolutely zero to do with the media. In fact, this whole discussion is itself a pristine example of media hype. I mean, this is the media, Al Jazeera, and we're conjuring up a program here, and so we're making a lot of excitement, and we have this notion, oh, the media did it. It's ridiculous. The media is so diverse in America. It's thousands and thousands of journalists, of newspapers, of television and radio shows that have today and had at the beginning of the war and always have a wide variety of views. Americans are exposed every day to all views. If, in fact, the media had any, the media per se, as one grand agglomeration, had any effect, then we have to ask ourselves this very odd question, which is, where did its power go? Its power just disappeared like that, because today the war is tremendously unpopular with Americans. We have one poll after another showing the war is unpopular, showing that Bush is unpopular, and the war is unpopular with all major news commentators, newspapers.
Having said that, Joshua Muravchik,
but the war is going on. Bush hasn't changed his policies.
Indeed, it is
going on.
So
the media has no power at all.
Indeed, it's going on. He mentioned, Michael Isakov, that we pay the president and the vice president to say these words. We pay also the newspapers, to check what the president and vice presidents say. Did they do their job? And is this a belated apology on behalf of Joshua Muravchik?
Well, look, as the one member of the news media here, let me try to speak up for my profession without defending its record on the on Iraq. There's no question that the run-up to the war in Iraq was not one of the glorious episodes in American journalism. There were a lot of really egregious examples of mainstream news organizations that were used and manipulated by the administration to project stories that have turned out to be false. And, more seriously, there were serious doubts about the veracity of what was being said at the time within the United States government. And that was not disclosed to the American public until after the war. The very phrase that Josh used in the, cited, showing both Condi Rice and the president use in the run-up to the war, we can't wait for the smoking gun in the form of a mushroom cloud. That was predicated on evidence about seizures of aluminum tubes and, to a lesser degree, uranium purchases in Africa, about which there were profound doubts within the intelligence community, by the State Department, by agencies of the government. But we didn't learn of those dissents and the doubts until after the war. There were news stories, most prominently in the New York Times, just at a critical moment when the administration was launching its campaign to sell the American public on the war, that suggested this was hard, firm evidence that was not in dispute. That was wrong. That was said to the American public, and it was wrong, and there were people who knew it was wrong at the time, and that's really bad. You know, that said, there were people that tried to get at those doubts. There were news stories, news organizations that asked probing, tough questions. The stories did not get as much play as the stories that meshed with what the administration was saying. They should have gotten more attention. Most news organizations, including mine, wrote stories that raised some really serious questions about aspects of the administration's case. But did we ask enough aggressive questions? Did we write enough of those stories? No question about it, we didn't.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. Now we're going to look at the second report by Josh Rushing about the role of the media and what happened afterwards. Let's watch.
It took about a year after the invasion of Iraq, but a press that apparently initially supported the war eventually issued mea culpas. First, the New York Times. Quote, "Looking back, we wish we had been more aggressive in re-examining the claims as new evidence emerged or failed to emerge." End quote. Then, the Washington Post. Quote, "Administration assertions were on the front page. Things that challenged the administration were on A18 on Sunday or A24 on Monday." End quote. But for those who sold the war, they had little time for such hand-wringing. Media coverage became even more critical of Operation Iraqi Freedom when the images from Abu Ghraib were broadcast around the globe. Today, how someone feels about the media's coverage of Iraq is often the best litmus test for their own stance on the war. War supporter, media only covers and thus reinforces the negative. War opponent, the media reports what they see: a war begun on misinformation, a civil war prolonged by mismanagement and misunderstanding, and a country destined for more misery.
Josh Rushing reporting again. Asad Abu Khalil, a quick comment about a belated apology by the American newspapers about what happened, that they got it wrong.
Right. I mean, here I heard Joshua Moravchik talking about this attempt to criticize the media by saying it doesn't have much influence. If that is the case, why do we see mainstream news media in the United States providing the reader with apologies about their very shameful record? Now, I do not agree with Michael Isikoff that Newsweek did raise some concerns. These were very muted and very sidestep concerns that they raised. The true record of heroic, courageous journalism was provided on the very margin by left-wing alternative media, among others, who did raise these concerns, as well as by the international media. Now, I want to say something that Joshua Moravchik said. He said, what's so abnormal about the president, the vice president making speeches? Absolutely, it's normal. The objection is not to them making speeches. It is to them lying to the American people when they knew better about what is being said to them about Iraq. I think it's very important. I understand why Mr. Moravchik would be very agitated, because neocons hinged all their project in the Middle East on the ability to provide an exemplary model of democracy. And now they realize better than ever that there are no takers. There is nobody in the Arab world who is looking at Iraq and urging that they have in their daily life car bombs on regular basis, shooting at checkpoints by American
Asad Abu Khalil, can I just interrupt you for just a second and pose that to Joshua Moravchik? One by one, the architect, the pillars of the neoconservative who advocated war, and in the initial phase of the war, they were with it. One by one, they left that camp and somehow they apologized for it. So how do you explain that?
I don't know what you're referring to.
I'm referring to Paul Bremer, I'm referring to Fukuyama, I'm referring to a lot of names I can cite you.
Yes, but the first name you mentioned is to call him a neocon is ridiculous. This is the first time I've ever heard Paul Bremer described as a neocon. So I think you're using the neocon as a boogie word, the way people use fascist or something, to mean anyone you disagree with. So I can't tell you anything about Paul Bremer.
Okay, in that case, let me cite you a few names and you tell me whether they are neocon or not. Hold on just a second. Would you say that Ken Edelman is a neoconservative or not? Would you say? Would you say that Richard Pearl is a neocon or not?
Yes.
Those people, they apologize for being wrong on the war.
Well, what's the question?
What's the question? Millions of people are dying, and America is in a quagmire, and we are asking, what's the question, Scott Ritter?
No, what's the question to me? Why don't you give me, instead of just making a speech at me, why don't you ask me a question, I'll try to answer it. What's your question?
My question was, you advocated the war, and now we are saying that wars happen.
Well, I don't know who's saying, I mean, maybe you're saying wars happen. I've not heard anybody, except for you, say wars happen. If what you're saying is that, people who advocated the war, in any number of them, now have second thoughts, well, yes, I'll put myself in that category. I never mind some odd list of names you can conjure together. The war, how could you not have second thoughts? The war has gone extremely badly. Iraq is in a terrible state, and Professor Khalil is right in saying that there's no way that Iraq can be a model for the region. And so
that's not what I said. You have made it. You have made sure that it doesn't become a model based on the foolish policies and the war that happened in Iraq. But I think if you realize, if you say now that you have second thought, the second question that should be posed to you is this: do you have any apologies to make to the families of the dead Iraqis and the dead Americans? Any apologies?
You are a very good demagogue, but why don't you speak when it's your turn to have the floor, and I'll speak when it's my turn to have the floor. The fact is that I and everybody else who's involved in this with an interest in international affairs and foreign policies have been involved for a long time in advocating different policies in different situations. If you're involved in policy advocacy, you always have to be aware that what you're talking about are things that have very big stakes, that involve war and peace and involve human lives. And I don't know anyone who has always been right. I know that the kinds of people you identify with Mr. Khalil have always been wrong.
Mr. Morabchik, perhaps I can bring one person who was perhaps right all along, Scott Ritter. Not only back in 2003, but way before that, you said this is going to be a calamitous enterprise, didn't you?
Look, there's no doubt. War is, I know war firsthand. Anybody who's put on the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor and wore in the uniform of an officer of Marine and had the opportunity, the privilege of leading Marines in times of war understands the seriousness of combat. I trained for it. I actually engaged in it. And, not for a second would I say I'm a pacifist and I would shy away from military conflict, engage for the legitimate purpose of defending my country or my country's interests. But I would never engage in an academic-based discussion about war lightly. You're right, there are consequences for policy decisions, and these consequences must be weighed out. At no time did the advocates of military conflict with Iraq weigh out the reality of a post-Saddam environment. Today we have a lot of hand-wringing. The war's gone bad. Well, duh. Of course it's gone bad. Our nation's in a calamitous situation. Iraq is destroyed. Our national credibility is in tatters. The question I have for those hand-wringers today who said we were merely advocating policy is, have you learned your lesson? My understanding is you've advocated that we strike Iran. Excuse me, Iraq has gone bad. I'm telling you right now, Iran will get 10 times worse. Do you continue to advocate an aggressive military stance against Iran, knowing what we know about how badly things have gone in Iraq? No, we have ideologues who sit behind a desk in Washington, D.C., advocating ideologically motivated policy objectives that are so far removed from reality, the truth on the ground. We knew what the truth on the ground was in Iraq. Anybody who spent quality time in Iraq, as I did for almost a decade, knew that this was a war that was A, based on false premise, and B, was not going to succeed in its ultimate objectives because the ideologically motivated justifications for the conflict were so far removed from the reality on the ground. I make that case for Iraq. I made it before the war. I make it today. And I'm making that case for Iran. Anybody who advocates military strike against Iran today is making the same mistake we made in Iraq 10 times over.
Thank you, gentlemen. We'll take a short break now, and when we come back, we continue our discussion. Stay with us.